Hello, in this video, let us talk about imaginary numbers. Imaginary numbers are also known as complex. So let's illustrate it with a question. Let's suppose we wanted to solve x squared equals 9. To cancel the square, we take square root of both sides, and the square and square root cancels off. We take square root of 9, and each time we take a square root, we put plus minus in front of it because there is two solutions, plus and minus. So that gives us the solution, plus minus 3. There is two answers because the question is really asking for, give me two numbers that are exactly the same, so that when you multiply them together, the answer is 9. Well, there is two ways to do it. We can use 3 times 3. We could also use negative 3 times negative 3. Both make 9, which is why we include both of these as the answer, plus minus 3. Now, if we change this question just a little bit to negative 9, and we try to answer the same question, well, what two numbers multiplied together make negative 9? That's not possible, because if the two numbers are exactly the same, there is no way to multiply two numbers that are the same to make a negative, because we just did this here. Positive and positive is plus, negative times negative is also plus. How do we get negative 9? We don't. There is no way. So that means this question has no real solutions. And by real we mean that if we look at all the real numbers are positives, negative, decimal, fraction, square root of some positive number, irrational number. So of all of these choices, none of them will solve our question. There is, of all of these, none could be used that would give us negative 9. So that means there is no real solution. Well, if we look at the process that we have done in solving the equation before, we can try it on this expression as well. We can take square root of both sides. But then what does it do? Well, on one hand, that tells us that square and square root cancels out, so we get x. On the other hand, what is square root of negative 9? Well, that's the same as 9 times negative 1. And the 9 times negative 1 can be written separately. And we do know what square root of 9 is. We did it in the previous example, and we know that's 3. The only thing we don't know is what the square root of negative 1 is. And that is what's called an imaginary number, or I for short. So we define I to be square root of negative 1. So by definition, we agree that I is square root of negative 1. Well, if we happen to square both sides here on the side, if we happen to square both sides, we know that square and square root cancels out because we just applied it in a second ago, and that gives us a very interesting fact, meaning that I squared is actually negative 1, just regular old negative 1. And these are the two very important facts that we have to know and have to remember when we work with imaginary numbers, because that tells us what imaginary numbers are. Now, just for practice, let us solve a quadratic equation that actually has imaginary numbers. And we will also use calculator as well, because calculators can work with imaginary numbers, so we'll do it also with a calculator. So here is an example of solve, and let's have x to the 2 minus 6x plus 34 is 0. Now this is a quadratic equation and it has the coefficients are a is 1, b is negative 6, c is 34. Our quadratic formula is negative b plus minus square root b squared minus 4ac divided by 2 times a. Substituting all of these coefficients into the formula, we get negative, then comes the b, which is negative 6 plus minus square root b negative 6 squared minus 4 times a times c, all of it divided by 2 times a. Now let's type in everything inside the square root into our calculator and see what comes out. So here is inside the parentheses negative 6 squared, then minus 4 times 1 times 34, and that makes negative 100. So we now know that inside the square root we have negative 100. That makes here square root of negative 100, and then two negatives make a plus, so we have 6 plus minus square root of negative 100 divided by 2. And now we know that square root of negative is going to be an imaginary number. Each time we see a negative inside the square root, that will make an imaginary number. So what we have is we have 6 plus minus square root of 100, and then that negative is the I on the outside. It's the imaginary number on the outside. Now we divided both of these by 2. So 2 goes into 6 3 times. Square root of 100 is 10. And 2 goes into 10 5 times. So what we have is we have 3 plus or minus 5i. Meaning there is 2 solutions to our question. So this question has 2 solutions. X is 3 plus 5i, x is 3 minus 5i. Now we notice that the complex numbers always come in pairs. There will always be 2 of them. One with the opposite signs in the middle. So these complex numbers come in pairs called complex conjugates. The conjugate simply means related. So these numbers are related because there will always be opposite signs, because each time, because the complex numbers come from taking a square root, and each time we take a square root, there will be plus minus, so there will always be 2 of them in the final answer. Now the calculators can also get us the same result. So let's type in this entire question with the parentheses in the calculator. But we have to do one step. If we don't do that one step, we're not going to get an answer, we're going to get an error. So just to show what happens, how this can be an error, let's type it in without changing any settings. So here's what it looks like if we do it incorrectly. Negative, well, 2 negatives will make a 6, so let's make 6 plus square root, and then negative 6, let's say negative 6 squared minus 4 times 1 times 34, and the entire question divided by 2 times 1, which is 2. Now the calculator is not set in the right mode, and it's telling us that we're in real mode and there is no answers here. Now we can change it by going to the mode. So if we go to the mode, change from the real, there is real, right next to it is a plus bi. That's a form we need. That's a form for the imaginary numbers. So instead we change to a plus bi, hit enter. Now when we retype the entire question, we will get 3 plus 5i. The 3 plus 5i is exactly the answer that we had when we worked it out by hand. And if we want to retype this whole line quickly, we can press second entry and come up to the middle here and change the plus to the minus, and here is the second, 3 minus 5i. So this is how we can use the calculator to do the imaginary numbers. And that's it for this video. The only thing that we can mention is this form that the calculator had us use, a plus bi, is called the standard form of imaginary number. And the number without the a is called the real part of imaginary number, and the number with the I is called the imaginary part of the real number. So for our example, we had 3 plus 5i. So the real part of our answer, whatever that was 3, and the imaginary part was 5. And sometimes we will be asked to figure out which part is real, which part is imaginary. The number that is connected to the I, that's the imaginary one. That's the imaginary. The number without the I is the real part. That's all there is to it. And in the different video, we'll practice working with imaginary numbers. Thanks for that. Take care.